Welcome to the Humans and Earth podcast. We bring you inspiration and practical resources for healing our planet and ourselves. It is time for soulful contributions that regenerate life on Earth.
I'm Helen Claire Harmon, a thought leader and teacher who believes we're ready to renew Earth and heal ourselves in the process. Welcome to today's episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Humans and Earth. I am delighted today to be talking with Bill Plotkin, Ph.D. He is a depth psychologist, a wilderness guide, and an agent of cultural evolution. As founder of Western Colorado's Animas Valley Institute in 1981, he has guided thousands of seekers through nature-based initiatory passages, including a contemporary Western adaptation of the pan-cultural vision quest. He has been a research psychologist, professor of psychology, psychotherapist, rock musician, and whitewater river guide. In 1979, on a solo winter ascent of an Adirondack peak, Bill experienced a call to adventure, leading him to abandon academia in search of his true calling. Bill is the author of Soulcraft, Crossing into the Mysteries of Nature and Psyche, Nature and the Human Soul, Cultivating Wholeness and Community in a Fragmented World, and The Journey of Soul Initiation, a field guide for visionaries, evolutionaries, and revolutionaries, just published in January of 2021. And I think I also missed his book prior to that, Wild Mind, a field guide to the human psyche. You can find Bill at animus.org, and I will publish that address in the show notes. And as we begin, I will give you just a brief sense of the premise of Bill's new book, The Journey of Soul Initiation, which is that the root cause of our human and ecological problems is a failure of individual development. Our aim, he believes, is to develop so that we may be life-enhancing for Earth and ourselves. Welcome, Bill. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you today.
Thanks so much, Helen. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity.
So you and I know, a lot of people know, there's no denying that human civilization is facing really large challenges right now. We have all of these indicators ranging from climate change and the decline of ecosystems and species to a massive wealth gap between rich and poor, ongoing social inequities of many types, mental health crises, etc. You believe that our solutions lie in a very deep maturation process for the human species, a coming into true adulthood and therefore a true partnership with the earth. And I certainly agree. You've stated that we now have an opportunity for humanity to discover and embody our unique ecological niche on Earth. And the process that you describe as our pathway in that direction is one that you call soul initiation. Would you like to begin today by telling our listeners, what is soul initiation?
Yep, thank you. That'd be the good place to start. And I'll say right off the bat here that it's challenging to explain it to people who are first hearing about it for the first time, because when we hear the word initiation, we have all kinds of connotations, associations with that word. But soul initiation is not only a class of life passages that have become relatively rare in the contemporary world, but it's a specific passage that most contemporary people never reach because our contemporary cultures don't support the kind of human maturation that's required to reach the stage of life where we go through the process or the journey of soul initiation. So the journey of soul initiation is a whole stage of life. And it corresponds to what I call late adolescence, which people usually think, oh, you mean the late teen years, but but actually, no. Early adolescence starts after puberty, of course, but it can go on indefinitely. And if you live in a culture that doesn't support the deeper human development, then people get stuck in early adolescence, no matter how long they live. And the journey of soul initiation takes place on the next stage, which I call the cocoon, which corresponds to late adolescence. Late adolescence is all about an initiatory process into true adulthood. So soul initiation, I believe, is something that every single human longs for really deeply, probably starting around the age of 15. There's this really deep longing, but in the contemporary world, virtually nobody knows what that longing is. It's something that arises up from our core. And we tend to, with our conscious minds or egos, we tend to misinterpret it because it's a very deep kind of romance. And so the most common misinterpretation of this longing for soul initiation is that it's one is seeking a human beloved. And of course, a romantic relationship is one of the greatest joys of life, but there's this other kind of relationship with our souls that we also long for. And if we don't understand what's going on, we'll misinterpret it. So it's paradoxical, perhaps, to say that every human over the age of 15 or so longs for this kind of experience, but in the contemporary world, very few people ever go through the actual journey. I would say between 15 and 20% of contemporary humans at the most ever reach this cocoon stage where the journey begins. One way to say it, I think you've already said it, Helen, is that the journey of soul initiation is what results in true adulthood. And one of the implications of what I'm saying is that we have relatively few true adults in the world, if it's the case that most people don't get to the stage where this journey happens. And even the word adult, it almost has a bad reputation in many circles, like it just sounds like a really dull, responsible, burdened kind of life. But true adulthood is incredibly exciting because what we're doing in true adulthood is we're living out the purpose that we were born to embody and born to gift to both a human community and the larger Earth community. Because maybe this would be a good point to tell our listeners what I mean by soul, because I'm a psychologist, but I never understood really what the word soul meant, even when used by psychologists. And I finally came to the conclusion that this very new discipline we call Western psychology, which is only 120 years old, has misunderstood and misused the word soul, actually. It finally dawned on me that soul is actually an ecological concept, not a psychological one or a spiritual one. And here's what I mean. It's very simple. The soul of a thing is its unique ecological niche. That everything, every species, but also every individual of every species is born to support life in its ecosystem in a unique kind of way. Everything is born with a gift to give away to everything else. All of life is designed and evolved to be life enhancing, not only of its own species, but of all species and its habitat. Well, then we have to scratch our heads a bit because we have to notice, and I'm sure everybody listening has noticed, that our species is not life enhancing, not right now, and maybe it hasn't been for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that we're actually destroying life on the planet. Everybody knows about the 6th mass extinction and climate disruption and so on. So my understanding has come to this, that the reason we're not a life-enhancing species, not even a life-sustaining species, the reason we're destroying life on our planet is because we've lost, the most contemporary societies have lost the practices and the understandings of the journey of soul initiation, and have lost the adults whose life work is to guide that journey, and have lost the elders who also guide the journey. So what my colleagues and I at Animus Valley Institute have been doing the last 40 years is learning kind of from scratch, what is this journey? What's the deep structure of it, which is to say the phases, and how can we at Animus Valley Institute create a contemporary nature-based Western version of it without appropriating or stealing anything from any indigenous cultures, because we really have to find our own way to do it. And through trial and error, we're still developing an understanding of how to guide this journey. And it's a journey. The journey of soul initiation is generally several years. It's a whole life stage. And my book is primarily about the core spiritual adventure that happens at least once during the journey, which I call the descent to soul. That's probably good enough for an initial introduction. Thanks.
Very helpful. Very helpful. There are all kinds of things I'd like to ask you that branch out from that. But I think the first place I'd like to go is the question of, if someone who's listening to this conversation or watching it, if they're really not sure where to begin to plug in, what would you recommend? So in a minute, I'd like to ask you about how we continue deepening some of the things that you just laid out, but kind of first at the more basic level, if we have a listener who is just waking up to a lot of these problems and the crucial immaturity of the majority of the human species, and they'd like to move forward into a more soul-guided life in partnership with the life community, what are some foundational things for people to do or seek or experience, in your view?
Yeah, that's exactly the right question. Thank you. Again, I'm trained as a psychologist, but I ended up feeling that, or concluding that the developmental models in contemporary Western culture just don't get at the majority of the potentials of human development. And the kind of spiritual experiences people can have depend entirely on what stage of life they're in. So the first thing I would say to people, in answer to your question, Helen, is to get some clarity about what stage you're in. The people listening to this, assuming that there aren't children in the background listening, are going to be in what I call either early adolescence or late adolescence, and possibly later. I mean, you can go through the journey of soul initiation without any understanding really what's going on, like as happened to Carl Jung. And you don't have to have utter guidance for it. And a certain small percentage of Westerners do go through it on their own. But the main question for people would be, what are you in this early adolescent stage, which I don't mean that as a criticism. It's early adolescence. It's a great stage to be in. And again, it's regardless of chronological age. That I call that early adolescent stage the oasis. Or are you in the cocoon when the journey of soul initiation happens? That makes all the difference in the world. Because if you're in early adolescence and you pretend you're on the journey of soul initiation, you could really do a lot of harm to yourself, because the journey is actually counter-therapeutic. It will undermine your adaptation to your friends, your family, your job, your romantic partnership, if you have one, your career, your social role. It undermines all of that. Everything about your identity crumbles. And if that happens to someone when they're in early adolescence, it can be a profound and very serious psychological health crisis. So regardless of which of those two stages or even later stages you're in, one thing that everybody can do, and virtually all of us in Western cultures and contemporary societies more generally, need to do what we call at Animus cultivating the four facets of our human wholeness. So, and this is discussed in great length in my third book, which is entitled Wild Mind. So the idea is that we're each born with kind of a set, you call it a tool bag, but it's a bundle of resources that we need to cultivate in order to have a healthy human life in any stage of life. And very briefly, I use archetypes to refer to those four facets of wholeness, and they are the nurturing generative adult, which is associated with the north, and in the east is the innocent and the sage, both, and in the south is called the wild indigenous one, which is the part of us that just naturally instinctively feels our kinship with everything on the planet and loves being embodied and loves our own body and thinks and feels that every emotion is a very useful sacred experience. And then in the west is what we call the Dark Muse beloved. This is the one that loves to descend to the depths and is fascinated by death and the undoing of things and is deeply creative. So that's why the muse is part of that phrase. So there's these four facets of wholeness, and each one of us tends to be born with a strength in one of them, and the other three tend to be weak unless we get support in cultivating them. And our contemporary educational systems, family systems, etc., usually neglect all four of these facets of our humanness because our industrialized consumer societies don't want us to grow up, because a true adult would not be interested in being a consumer. If you ever hear on the radio or TV someone referring to consumers of buying more or less than last month, or what, any true adult would be insulted by that. What are you calling me a consumer? But most people just take that in stride, that yeah, we're consumers. So the first thing I would recommend to people is to cultivate the facets of wholeness that are weakest for you. And for most Western people, it's that West facet, the Dark Muse beloved, and the South facet, the indigenous one, wild indigenous one, are the weakest, because those are the ones that are most suppressed by contemporary culture. And those are the qualities that patriarchal male leaders of our world call feminine, which is a way to say that it's not like them. And of course, everybody has all four facets equally, and they need to be cultivated. The second thing I would recommend is that people get some clarity about whether they've completed the oasis stage. That's the early adolescent stage. And the way you know you've completed it is you've succeeded in a significant degree with the developmental task of that stage, which is to create a social presence, especially in your peer group, that is fully authentic and accepted by your friends, basically, so that you have this very deep sense of social belonging. And you're not just accepted, you're being real. You're expressing your true values and interests and style and so on, and you don't hesitate to do that. And that's a achievement that so many people in the contemporary world don't get to, because you might say our culture is actually structured in such a way to keep people from doing that. Again, so people don't grow up, so that they'll be happy consumers. When we talk about human development, people often think of therapy and about healing. And as a person who's been a psychotherapist for a long time, I'm a great believer in healing and therapy. But it's important to say that the journey of soul initiation, again, it's not therapeutic at all. It's not another way to heal. It's not a way to fix a life that feels ruined. So when somebody gets from the oasis to the cocoon, which is a life passage I call confirmation, what's true of them is that they feel successful in their life, that they've got a social network, a social circle that's really deeply loving. They feel affirmed and accepted. Their primary relationship is at least okay, if not great. They've been working at a job or a career or a creative project that has given them lots of fulfillment. Those are the people who are going to be starting the journey of soul initiation. And soon into that journey, your belief in the identity you've been living in the earlier stage of the oasis crumbles. And even though you were so successful or successful enough in every dimension of your life, just like the air gets let out of all your tires and you don't believe in it, that vehicle of identity anymore. And that's when the journey really gets started.
Thank you. I think that gives a lot of possibilities for people to consider. Here's another question I have. You've already alluded to parts of how industrialized cultures tend to view a process like soul initiation as a hardship to be avoided. And so I'd love to hear you speak about how we can individually regain our sense of that adventure, of the deep value in soul initiation, when most of us live in a culture in which that is countercultural, not valued, and even, as you've said, profoundly discouraged. So how do we individually connect to the joy of the adventure of this process?
Yeah, first thing to say is the journey of soul initiation is completely off the map of contemporary mainstream Western understandings of what life is about. So literally speaking, that journey is not discouraged. It's just not even known of. It's completely, it's totally off the radar. It's way beyond the edge of the map where the dragons dwell. But to emphasize or to elaborate on your point there, that when people begin to the journey, or especially when they begin that particular spiritual adventure during the journey, which I call the descent to soul, and they don't know what's going on, and they get worried about themselves, and their friends and family get worried about them, and they go to see a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist. Most therapists and psychiatrists would consider that there's some kind of pathology going on and try to yank that person out of that experience, which is a real tragedy. So where do you connect with the joy of this journey? The journey is harrowing in many ways, but it's absolutely ecstatic and joyful in other ways. And what feeds, or what leads, or maybe let's just say an essential component of launching on the journey is this deep longing that we're all born with. And it's inside of us. It's not something has to be inserted into you by yourself or somebody else. We have this deep longing for meaning and this deep longing to participate in the larger Earth community, not just the human village, in a way in which we're helping to enhance life in our own little unique way. So when you're ready for the journey of soul initiation, and in particular the descent to soul, you will naturally, you might say automatically, connect with this very, very deep longing. And especially if you have some practices to say yes to that longing, which is one of the things we've been developing contemporary versions of at Animus, by embodying that longing, it leads to a certain kind of joy. a certain kind of desire to go to the edge of life as you've understood it, and to jump into the depths. So in a sense, I'm answering your question, Helen, by saying it's already built into us, that when we're ready, we will feel the joy and the desire for the journey, and a longing to connect with this, again, this thing I call our unique ecological niche, that we were each born to take a certain place in the larger Earth community. And what I call soul encounter is the experience, is a glimpse of what that place is. And we don't glimpse our unique ecological niche, which is, say, our soul in literal ecological terms. The way we humans experience it is through metaphor. So when a person has a soul encounter, which again is a glimpse of that unique echo niche they were born for, it's an experience of like a symbol or an archetype or a line of poetry or a dance movement, or an image of some sort. The poet David Whyte refers to the truth at the center of the image you were born with. And that's lovely poetry, of course, but what if we took it literally, which I believe we ought to, that we each are actually born with a certain sacred image. And we go through childhood unable to access that and not particularly interested or developmentally ready to access it. And early adolescence is about creating our own social presence that's somewhat different from our parents' value system. So it's not till late adolescence that we are developmentally ready to access that image that we're born with. And there's a truth at the center of that image. And that's the truth that, you might say, mystery wants us to live into this lifetime.
I really appreciate your emphasis that this calling, this longing is innate in us. And there is a deep joy in cultivating that authenticity of the unique self. And of course, you and I both know, and probably most of our listeners do, that to enact everything we're talking about requires a profound rebuilding of human civilization as we know it, at least in the industrialized cultures, because as you've implied, our educational system is not very conducive to soul initiation. Our professional and economic systems are not very conducive. Much of the parenting that we practice is not very conducive. So another thing that I was really curious to ask you about is what's your big vision of how all this might look? Feel free to take maybe the 20-year and or the 100-year points forward, because this is definitely an individual human path, and your books are one particular set of guides to that path. This is a journey that can be accomplished in a solitary way. But of course, one of the purposes of your institute is to provide structures for community support of this journey. So I wonder what you think our world might look like in 20 and or 100 years when it's actually easy for individuals to access some kind of support, whether it's in their family or their education or the larger culture, or because we have an Animas Valley Institute in every county. Where do you think we might be aiming in terms of enlarging our structures of support for soul initiation?
What a wonderful question. Opportunity to muse about that. As you might suspect, I do think 20 years is overly optimistic. And at Animas Valley Institute, we're developing what we call a 300-year plan. And so who knows how long it'll actually take, but things are already happening. We've been invited to guide immersions, initiatory immersions, in something like 15 or 20 different countries around the world now. And we have we have over 20 guides and close to 100 trainees. But yeah, to ask, like, what would our societies look like when they became mature societies or life-enhancing societies? Because I believe every culture of the future that is healthy will have their own version of the journey of soul initiation, including how to prepare people for that journey, which is to say, how to help them have a healthy childhood and a healthy early adolescence. So if we had a society like that, I'm actually coming up with, the Muse is whispering, but there's two versions. One is like an in-between interim version where there are organizations that offer guidance on the journey of soul initiation. The first level of guidance is simply to help the person understand if they're ready to start the journey. That's one of our greatest services at Animus is to tell people, no, don't think you're quite ready. And here's the kind of things we recommend you do to get ready, which has to do with cultivating the 4 facets of human wholeness, learning how to self-heal, and also addressing the most unfinished developmental tasks from earlier stages. So there'd be organizations all over the world, like Animus Valley Institute, that would support people on the journey. And before long, and we hope this is actually going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years, and we're actually quite certain it will be, colleges and universities will all have people trained as what we call soul initiation guides, because it's in our early 20s, and given the contemporary human and how we're evolving, and how adolescence is stretching out a little bit, which is actually a good thing, as long as you get past it. Given that, for most people, it'll be in their very late teens or early 20s that, in the best circumstances, might be ready for the journey. These days, I mean, the last 20 or 30 years at Animus, it's relatively rare for people in their early 20s to be ready, but late 20s, not uncommon at all, especially at the time of that first Saturn return, age 28 to 30. So there would be organizations around the world where people can be guided, and also these same organizations would be training additional guides. But there would also be new understandings, let's say earth-based or nature-based understandings of how to raise children. One of my colleagues at Animus, he and his wife, that's their specialty, and they're learning in part by raising their own children in ecocentric and soul-centric kinds of ways. So this will start showing up, this knowledge of how to raise children ecocentrically, which is already developing in many ways in the world, with forest schools, with like Richard Lou's book, Last Child in the Woods, and so on. But this will deepen, and there are community schools I know of, that some of whom have been basing their work on the developmental model that we've developed at Animus. And they are supporting teenagers to do their holding work and their self-healing work in order to, among other things, prepare for the journey of soul initiation. So we'd see this in colleges and universities, and we'd see it more and more in religious organizations. And we're seeing that happen the last 10, 15 years at Animus. We have, one of my colleagues has a training program called, actually several of my colleagues, called the Seminary of the Wild. And they are retraining clergy to do this kind of nature-based work, both in supporting the holing and healing of their congregation, but also to prepare them for the journey of soul initiation. So we'll start seeing this more and more in spiritual circles and religious organizations. The whole spiritual orientation would, in a certain sense, get supplemented or doubled. Here's what I mean, that I've come to understand that there's two spiritual journeys. One goes upward and one goes downward, and they're both necessary for our human development. And they're complementary. They're not in competition with each other, but they're very, very different. And that downward spiritual journey, which of course I call the descent to soul, is pretty much not on our Western maps at all. The upward journey is the journey to either merge with or be in relationship with the divine oneness, the experience of non-duality, developing a relationship with the divine, God, the Tao, mystery, whatever people call it. That profound sense of being part of this vast consciousness or imagination that is unfolding our world. But the other spiritual journey goes down towards what is unique about us, but not on the personality or ego level, but in terms of our unique ecological niche. So that downward half of the spiritual experience, what we'll see in our fantasy here in 20 or more years is will become, everyone will understand that there's that journey as well. And then if we go out to 100 years or more, you wouldn't have organizations like Animus anymore that are offering 5-day programs, 7-day programs, 14-day long programs, because just even this idea of a human development program is an artifact of our contemporary culture. What you would actually have is you have people living in villages, not too many in urban areas. Again, we're 100 years out or so, assuming we don't go extinct this century. And there would be approximately 25% of the people alive would be true adults, and almost a quarter of the people would be true elders. And one of the things that true elders do, all kinds of things. Maybe most importantly, they make sure that the relationship between the human village and the larger earth community is a good one. That's reciprocal and mutually reinforcing and enlivening. And someone's got to do that. The adults are too busy with their own soul work, and it's the elders who make sure they balance is good with the larger web of life. But the elders are also supporters of initiation for all there's lots of initiations in a lifetime. But one of the things they're going to be doing is they're going to be hanging out where the young people in early adolescence are, and they're going to be watching them. And they'll be very good, the elders, at noticing when there's a young person who's beginning to show signs of this passage I called confirmation, namely where they have so beautifully embodied a unique social style and a capacity to successfully court a lover. And they're beginning to see something like poetry beginning to flow out of the young person's gestures and out of their mouth. And these are just examples of clues that the elders will have that this person is ready for the journey of soul initiation. And they will take that person aside and congratulate them for having done such a phenomenal job at creating just a beautiful manifestation of young humanness, and say, you're done with that identity now, that you're going to be starting a journey now where you're going to find the identity that you were born to embody, and it's you, which can never, ever be described in social terms as a social role as a career, as a profession, as a creative project, because it's our unique ecological niche, as I say, can only be understood metaphorically. So let me give a quick example here. And the easiest one for me to give is my own. At the time of my first soul encounter, when I was 30, it was during a vision fast, which, by the way, is not necessary at all for the journey of soul initiation, but it's a ceremony we find all over the world that's very helpful on the journey. And I was at tree line at 11,500 feet for 5 days alone in the Colorado mountains. And I had a interaction on the 4th day of my fast with a spruce tree and a butterfly. And I'm just going to cut to the chase here, just so I give you this example. That the butterfly, I saw it coming a ways off, and it flew directly to me and actually brushed the left side of my face with its wing. And on her way by, I heard her say, "Cocoon weaver." And it took me a couple of minutes, but I got it that two things. I had no idea what just happened. I had no idea what that meant. And I absolutely knew I had just been gifted with a glimpse of who I was born to be, or what I was born to do. And but I want to emphasize that a soul encounter is not primarily information. It's not like I wrote in my journal, "Cocoon weaver." Okay, so my job is to weave cocoons, whatever that is. I'll get started on Tuesday. What happens after soul encounter is this phase of the descent that I call metamorphosis, where the power and energy of that soul encounter begins to reshape our human egos and shifting it from an adolescent ego, who's more or less an agent for himself, to an adult ego eventually that is an agent for soul. Okay, so I could go on about what our cultures would look like, but maybe I'll just add this. We wouldn't primarily see ourselves as conformists, and we wouldn't be conformists, and we wouldn't see ourselves as consumers. And there would be laws, of course, that would require any corporation, if there are such things, to never do any damage to the Earth system. So our whole understanding of what a job is and what a life is about would be different. And another one is that virtually nobody would ever start a family until they were soul initiated, because everybody would recognize that the depth and beauty of child raising is a whole different thing when the parents are soul initiated. Okay, I better stop there.
Yeah. That's really rich, Bill. I very much appreciate your references to child rearing and, what you didn't spell out, but one of the, I think, many strands there is so many people are halted in their development because of trauma in their early years. And if we had more adult people taking on the parenting role and we didn't traumatize our children and young people so much, this whole process that you emphasize could unfold more quickly and more easily, probably. So I very much agree with you about the importance of the child rearing piece and the ways in which schooling at all levels operates. Like you, I have experience in higher ed, and I see so many unmet needs for people in that 18 to 22-year-old range. And Yeah, the thought that we might remedy that we might turn childhood and youth into opportunities for nurturing of this kind is very, very inspiring. I also really hear you about the kind of creativity. I mean, I think of it as an individual authenticity that leads to tremendous creativity, because if we stop being conformists and the emphasis is instead on what is your soul calling, what is contained, or what is the information in your individual soul that you are to bring forth, then we go way beyond conformity into a really rich and beautiful creativity, and probably co-creativity with the natural world.
Yes, yeah, I very much agree. I mean, even in early adolescence, if it's a healthy early adolescence, we access our deep imagination. And we get very creative with our personal style and so on, which is part of creating that early adolescent, creating a social presence that works. So, and probably I believe it's true that of our 4 windows of knowing, I'll get to that in a second, our imagination is the one that's most suppressed by contemporary societies. Because people who've embraced and cultivated their deep imagination are very creative people who are not going to put up with a conformist view, a conformist lifestyle, and are going to rebel and revolt against what T.S. Eliot called the wasteland, the flatland, which is just contemporary conformist consumer culture. So in a healthy culture, a child's imagination is deeply supported and nurtured. I was going to mention the 4 windows of knowing, that there's these 4 ways that we humans are born, are designed, if you will, or have evolved to know the world. And all 4 windows are essential to being fully human. And all 4 are suppressed in one way or another, especially 2 of them. So the one everybody thinks of first is thinking. Thinking is one way to know things. A second way is through our senses, more or less what we consider our 5 senses, although you can expand the number of senses quite a bit beyond that. But more generally through observation, observing the world. And just to start with those 2, that contemporary people are able to think, but it's not very honed or deep thinking. It tends to be more rote learning. But the deeper kind of thinking is something that's not encouraged by most school systems, and of course ought to be and need to be. And same with observing, that there's a lot we can do to cultivate just our 5 senses and our ability to appreciate the world in that way. The 3rd window is feeling. And feeling includes our emotional life, our capacity to know that we're having an emotion and something's going on in our body, and get to learn about what it is, how it's trying to help us. And another aspect of feeling is our feeling sense, like being able to get some sense of the vibe, if you will, of a person or a social setting or a building or a meadow. And the 4th window of knowing is imagination. And I believe that our imagination is our most powerful human window, and it's the one that's most suppressed. Like the Beat poet Diane de Prima has a poem called Rant. And the primary line in the poem is something like this. I hope I can remember it. The only war that matters is the war against the imagination. The only war that matters is the war against the imagination. All other wars are subsumed in it. I think she's right.
Mm-hmm.
So even a early adolescent has a honed, healthy one has a honed imagination, and a late adolescent, but someone going through the journey of soul initiation, absolutely needs that deep creativity and that desire to, what do I call it? Crossing into the mysteries of nature and psyche. That's the subtitle of my first book, Soulcraft. That's what we're doing in some ways on the journey of soul initiation. We're crossing in, we're entering the world in a way we had never had before, that we know we have this intuition, this correct ancient human intuition that the world is so much more mysterious and diverse and deep than we ever had known in early adolescence, where life was naturally about our social life, our sex life, and so on. Not that our social life and the sex life ends, but that's what early adolescence is appropriately all about. But in late adolescence, our center of gravity moves from being primarily in the social and sexual field to being in, again, what I call the mysteries of nature and psyche. And the archetype of the late adolescent is the wanderer, whereas the early adolescent is the thespian. All life is a stage, a play. In the oasis, in the cocoon, during the journey of soul initiation, we become wanderers and we're wandering into the world. And to do that well, we have to be very creative. That we're going to be constantly coming across, encountering experiences that are really unusual. And they could be from our dreams or a deep imagination or a time in the wild world, or our meeting extraordinary other humans who trigger an opening in our consciousness. So that deep creativity is needed there to respond to what happens on the journey. And then in early adulthood, which I call the apprentice at the Wellspring, because in early adulthood, we start an apprenticeship with at least one delivery system, one art or discipline or vocation that is an effective way of delivering our gift to the world. But we never, after my initiation, I never thought of myself personally as a psychologist or a vision fast guide or a soulcraft guide. I always experienced myself as someone who helps people weave cocoons of transformation through the journey of soul initiation. And being a psychotherapist was one way I did that. And people thought of me, my clients, as a psychotherapist, but I thought of myself as a cocoon weaver. And same with the other delivery systems I've used. And then perhaps our deepest creativity in life comes in the next stage, which is late adolescence, which I call the artisan in the wild orchard. Because one thing we know about wild orchards, like apple trees, for example, is that no two apple trees are the same unless humans intervene and graft and so forth. That if you leave apple trees alone, every new tree will create a never before seen unique apple. So in late adulthood, our job our task, our opportunity, our joy is to create new forms, new delivery systems that have never before been seen. And that's the cutting edge of a healthy culture. That's where new social structures come out of the deep imagination, the deep creativity of late stage, what should you say, late adults, people in the second half of adulthood. And when those adults are working together, I call them vision ecologies, that there's these different visions, these different soul passions that are interacting with each other through the interaction of artisans in the wild orchard. That's when the biggest, foamiest unfolding of new cultural forms, healthy cultural forms, come from. So there's some musings anyways on your great question.
Yeah. That's wonderful. It gives us a lot to imagine and I think to look forward to. I mean, this is a larger topic for another conversation, but I'll just briefly say that I went through a period of real despair about the human situation and the human future on Earth, and I no longer see our situation with despair. I'm actually very inspired by how creative people are becoming in discovering a whole pathway forward. So I think everything that you just shared gives us a lot to be deeply enthusiastic about. There's one thing I would like to ask you as we come toward a close of our conversation, and it is about, I'll use the term ego, although I'm not entirely sure if that's the term that you'll want to use to respond. But I mentioned to you before we began today that a teacher I respect, Sandra Walter, is suggesting that we're at the beginning of a tremendous recrafting of ego and human will, so that we are emerging, and I mean, it may take 500 or 1,000 years, I don't know, but we're emerging from defining the ego and the will as do whatever you want, even if it causes harm, it's your free choice, into an era for humanity when, of course, free will and the ego exist, but they operate in a context of the good of all, the good for the life community. So how can I express myself as an individual, my individual creative choice, in consideration of the good of the life community? So I was curious as I read the book about your sense of what might be happening with ego or free will or any other term that you prefer.
Mm. Boy, there's so much to unpack there, possibilities. First thing I'll say is that a healthy early adolescent, which is becoming less prevalent in the world today, but a healthy early adolescent ego is one that is life-serving and has that as a frame of mind in all of its choices. That's just healthy early adolescence, nothing particularly fancy about it. And all healthy cultures in the past, people naturally were raised in such a way that they wanted to serve. I mean, that's a natural human desire, is to be helpful.
To contribute.
And to contribute. 1-year-olds have this instinct to be helpful.
They do. They really do. All small children do. Very telling. Yeah. I mean, I love where you're going with this, that this is actually who we are.
It's who we are. And we have that who we are has to be suppressed to end up who too many of us end up becoming in the contemporary world. So in early adolescence, by the time you get there, everybody's really in support. There's competition, but it's healthy competition. One aspect of cooperation is healthy competition, that we help each other develop our skills by competing. It's not about winning. It's about helping each other hone our skills and capacities. So then, free will it's not a term I regularly use, but I do understand what you mean, what people mean by it. And I do use the term ego, by which I don't mean some kind of problem we have. I mean just our capacity for self-consciousness, our conscious self-reflection, which is something that's distinctive about humans. We don't know if there's other species that have the same mode of consciousness we do, but there might be. But we for sure have this ego-based consciousness. And one thing the ego is capable of is, we might call it strategic planning. Sometimes just referred to as the strategic mind. And the strategic mind is really good at creating ways to get things done, of how do you do things. We strategize and we plan, and we use that aspect of our minds to do that. But the strategic mind is really lousy at deciding what to do in life. That's not something that is meant to come from our strategic mind, from the ego. But that's how we do it, because of how much and in what various dimensions we haven't developed earlier in our life. Again, it's not anybody's fault, it's the culture's fault. And it goes back thousands and thousands of years. And we probably don't have time now to go into that, but it's in the new book, The Journey of Soul Initiation, a sketch of how we ended up here after thousands of years of a kind of cultural decay. Okay, so the strategic mind, which is really the ego, you could say, is great at knowing how to do things. But the part of us that knows what to do in life, that's the soul. But the soul can't embody it. It needs the ego, is the one who can make it happen. The ego is a specialist in making it happen. The soul is a specialist in what's worth making happen. And so in many traditions, it's said that there's a love affair between the ego and the soul. That's that other deeper kind of romance. That's not meant to replace romance with a human partner, but it's different. It's a different thing. In some ways, it's deeper. And the soul is in love with the ego, with the mature ego, because the soul recognizes that that ego is the way that the soul's passion and gift can be embodied in this world. And the soul takes a look at this ego that has associated with it a head and hands and feet and a heart and so forth. And it has the capacity to manifest where the soul doesn't. And so you can imagine the soul just swoons over the ego's manifestation capacities. And the ego looks towards the soul and is completely moonstruck, because the soul is holding this passion that the ego could never have figured out or conjured up by itself, and is in love with the vision and the soul passion of the soul. And so that's why there's this a love affair. And one way to talk about the life passage of soul initiation, because the journey is everything it takes to get up to that passage. But one way to talk about soul initiation is it's the consummation of that relationship between ego and soul. It's the moment of the marriage between ego and soul, in which essentially ego on its part is saying, this is no longer primarily about me. I'm no longer primarily an agent for myself, even a loving agent for my family and village from the perspective of ego, but rather the rest of my life is about serving soul, is being the handmaiden, if you will, or the agent for soul.
I think that's wonderful. And it really is how we transform this world, or at least that's one brilliant formulation of how we transform this world, is that the human ego functions as the vehicle, as you said, or the partner in action of the soul's wise impulse.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Really beautiful. Bill, it's been really a pleasure to be in conversation with you. For everyone who's listening or watching, I certainly recommend The Journey of Soul Initiation, subtitled A Field Guide for Visionaries, Evolutionaries, and Revolutionaries. And again, you can find Bill at animus.org. Thank you so much, Bill. Really a pleasure to have you with us on Humans on Earth.
Thank you, Helen. I very much enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Humans on Earth. Please share this episode to broaden engagement in the regeneration our world needs. You'll find social media links in the show notes. To explore our other offerings, visit www.humansandearth.com.